Thank you. Hey, everybody. My name is Diego Carvajal. As you saw on the slide, I am a diversity, equity, and inclusion consultant and educator. I work for Velocarp Consulting. I used to be an attorney, finance attorney. I represented sovereign countries and state-owned entities in a lot of different finance transactions. I was lucky enough to work all over the world. I was in the US, Europe, and Latin America, Asia, and the Middle East. I'm an immigrant. I was born in Bolivia, but I was raised in Queens, New York. And I want to thank Nanali and everyone else there the opportunity to have this conversation because I think it's an important conversation to have. And I think it's a conversation that impacts all of us every day. And I think when we do have these conversations, it's important to bring it to the everyday. So as we begin, I want to ask all of you to think of something and think of something that you really like about yourself, something that's maybe really important to your identity, something that somehow has shaped how you see yourself and who you are. Maybe it's like a talent or a skill, or maybe you got a nice smile, or maybe you're very empathetic, or I don't know, maybe you're good at building things, or maybe really good at drawing, right? So think of something and try to make it as specific as possible, right? So I'll give everyone a second to think about it. Everyone's got something? Good. So now imagine that thing that you're thinking about, that's essential to your identity. Imagine that everybody around you, your friends, your family, your coworkers, your significant other, everyone tells you that you are wrong. They tell you that it's all in your head, that that thing that you perceive to be valuable is not. So that everybody begins to gaslight you. And gaslighting is exactly that. That it's when somebody tries to manipulate you, when somebody tries to tell you that your reality is wrong, that you're crazy for believing the things that you believe in, or that they never happened. And it's something that, happens a lot in certain types of relationships. How long do you think until you begin to believe everyone? How long do you think you can hold on to your own beliefs about yourself when everybody tells you that they're not true? And, it seems crazy and it seems like a far-fetched thing, but that's exactly what's been done to the contributions of Black people to world and American history. Except that it's not just family and friends that are saying this, it's teachers, it's textbooks, it's authority figures. Our collective understanding of world history is shaped by a white Eurocentric form of thinking. In essence, Western historical education is just this exercise of mass gaslighting. We're being told that only the great contributions to world history were only because of the idea of the genius white male, right? If you had a textbook that was similar to my textbook when I was growing up, the name of it, whether it's in Latin America or the United States, the name of the textbook was Our History or Our Story, right? And our story was mostly what the contributions of white men were. And if there was anything about women or there was anything about Black people or anyone who's not a white male, it was usually a small little box in the corner of the page or something, right? It was just something that was an aside. It was a footnote. And the way that we talked about everything, and particularly Black history, was very much a side thing, a footnote. When you talked about Africa, oftentimes, and to this day, when we talk about Africa, particularly when we talk about Africa in the 1500s and the 1600s, we think about tribes, and it's always about tribes as opposed to mass, powerful empires that had a huge impact on world history. When we study philosophy or medicine, any of you went to medical school or majored in philosophy, oftentimes it starts with the Greeks. It starts with Greeks' understanding of medicine and Greeks' understanding of philosophy, despite the fact that Egyptians knew the importance of the brain and practiced complicated medicine long before the Greeks. African societies had nurtured philosophical ideas for centuries before the Greeks. When we think about the Renaissance, we think of the genius of Da Vinci or Michelangelo. Well, we don't think about how much of what we know about the Renaissance was actually housed in the Empire of Mali. It was housed in Timbuktu. A diplomat in his book called The Description of Africa, which was published in 1550, writes about Timbuktu. And he says that if you go to Timbuktu and you go to any of the towns surrounding it, it was full of, quote, judges, professors, and doctors, where more profit was to be made from the sale of books than from any other branch or trade. Yet today, when you go to high school and you take an advanced placement class, all the advanced placement classes, particularly about history, well, they're AP European history. There is no AP African history. There is no AP Latin American history. And it really makes no sense because, when you take an AP European history, you learn about the War of the Roses, you learn about the 100 Years' War, things that happened thousands of years ago, but you don't learn about the Latin American history, the Black history that heavily impacted who we are as a country. You think about Haiti and the contributions of Haiti. Haiti, if it wasn't for Haiti and Haiti's powerful army, There is no South American liberation. There is no South American countries. It was only because Haiti and Toussaint Louverture lent his army to Simon Bolivar that all those countries were liberated. It was only because Haiti was able to defeat France, defeat Napoleon. And it's funny, when you hear about the defeat of Napoleon, you think all of Europe had to get together to defeat Napoleon. Well, guess what? Haiti defeated Napoleon. And because of that, Napoleon's resources in the Americas were spent, and he had to leave the Americas. Yet when we study the Louisiana Purchase, we think, or we are taught, well, just Jefferson was such a good negotiator. It had nothing to do with that. It had to do with the fact that Haiti had beat Napoleon. So if you were born or come from St. Louis, Kansas City, Denver, or even all the way up to Montana, the reason why you are in the United States has everything to do with Haiti. Yes, yet we don't learn about that. The fact that Tulsa and the legacy of Black Wall Street, an entire community of wealthy and successful Black Americans who were bombed to death. That's something that was not taught. That's something that only has reached the Oklahoma curriculum in 2020 is a tragedy. The fact that we don't know about the Wilmington insurrection of 1898, when you had Black representation at a peak in the United States, yet you had a white supremacist insurrection perform the first coup and only coup in the United States history in 1898, the fact that we don't know about that, it's an essential part of Black and American history, yet we don't know about it. And why do I say that this is gaslighting as opposed to just an omission? Well, that's the thing about gaslighters, right? Gaslighters, they discredit your version of events. They tell you, well, no, that never happened, right? You're trying to ruin the relationship. You're recharacterizing events. Well, that's how these things have been fixed. You know, people who talk about these things, they talk about the importance of race, they talk about the importance of Black contributions to American and world history. Well, they're called revisionists. They're, oh, this is revisionist history, right? Only because there's a certain type of history that has been accepted. And we know this too because the 1776 Commission, which was attempted to be established by the Trump administration, they called these ideas, they called the conversation about race and systemic racism, well, this is a radicalized view of history. They called it, quote, a twisted web of lies. So are we really surprised that although Black and brown communities have been talking about things like mass incarceration, police brutality, since there were jails or since there were police, it's only this past year that so many people realized that this was a problem? So what can you do? What can we all do, right? Well, I think we do the things that psychologists suggest we do when you are experiencing gaslighting. You try to give yourself a reminder of reality. You try to ground yourself in what's real and what actually happened. And we leave breadcrumbs for ourselves to find along the way. And I followed a breadcrumb that led me to you, led me to have this conversation with you. I don't know if I mentioned that I was born in Bolivia and I immigrated to the United States when I was 8 years old. And as soon as I came to the United States, I was instantly drawn to rap and hip hop right away. And it was all because of one rapper. It was all because of Tupac Amaru Shakur. Why? Well, because I knew that name. I knew that name since I was a child. My father had taught it to me. But he didn't teach it to me because of the rapper. He taught it to me because of who the rapper was named for. Tupac Amaru II led the largest indigenous revolt against Spain in Latin America. He's a hero and a symbol of hope in the face of injustice in Peru and Bolivia. Afeni Shakur, Tupac's mother, talked about why she named Tupac Amaru. She said, quote, I wanted to give him a name of a revolutionary. I wanted him to know that he was part of a larger world culture. Unquote. And by doing so, she left a breadcrumb for this little Bolivian kid to find because she connected me to his music. She connected my story to his story. And so as soon as I was learning English, I learned about the reality of systemic racism. I learned about police brutality. I learned about mass incarceration as I was learning English because I listened to hip hop and rap. But many others didn't. Why? Well, hip hop and rap was labeled a certain way. It's gangster music. They're using bad words. They talk about drugs, which is silly to me because have you heard rock music? I mean, it's the same things. So we titled today's conversation, Decolonizing Curriculums to Shine a Light on Black History. Because this idea of leading breadcrumbs, this idea of grounding ourselves in the reality of who people are, what is Black history, and what are the contributions that have been left behind, it's more than just today's conversation, it's a movement. It's a movement that began in South Africa. And in its manifesto, it says, quote, it's to imagine and envision all cultures and knowledge systems in the curriculum, and with respect to what is being taught and how it frames the world and frames how we think, unquote. And obviously this is a movement that started out in academia, but when I like to think about curriculums, when I like to think about what we teach, what we know as facts, it's far more far-reaching than just academia. It's what we talk about. It's how we frame who we are. It's our textbooks that say what our story is. It's how we perceive ourselves as Americans, as Europeans, as Asian, as African, whatever the case may be. And so, as you've done in other sessions and connecting the dots, we are going to do breakout groups. And in the breakout groups, we're going to ask you two questions. One is a question to reflect on, and the other is a question of how we move forward, how we act. What breadcrumbs do we want to leave behind? How do we ground ourselves in reality? The question that is about reflecting is we're going to ask you think about what is it that you learned recently when it comes to some of the things that we should have known all along. What was it? Were you surprised that you learned it? And how did you find out about it? And for many of us, who are steeped in some of this stuff, there's still so much more to learn. I was recently speaking to a colleague who was very well versed in James Baldwin and Lord, but Frantz Fanon was someone they didn't know. And by the way, I highly recommend Frantz Fanon, a philosopher from Martinique, Black philosopher from Martinique. So did you learn something new? And if so, what was it and how did you find out about it? And number two, because you learned this, because you were able to unearth this thing that we should have known, this massive contribution that we should have known, how did that impact how you saw the world? What do you see differently? How do you view things now? What have you done with that information? And what could others do to gain new information and continue to gaining that information? So we begin to decolonize the curriculum and decolonize how we think about Black contributions to our history and our story. So let's go to these breakout rooms. Let me pass it back to Nalini, and we can go on and continue the conversation.